This week we're talking about kingdom fungi. So as we go over our posters, your do now was to write down what characteristics all fungi share, how they reproduce, and what roles they play in nature. But since we're going to go over that in our notes here, let's just go ahead and go to the next page here. So first of all, domain eukarya, because of course all four of the other four kingdoms that we're studying, protist, fungi, plants, and animal, all have eukaryotic cells. So because they have eukaryotic cells, they're in kingdom eukarya. Kingdom eukarya. I'm sorry, domain eukarya. Exactly. So what does it mean that the cells are eukaryotic? Somebody quickly, what does it mean that the cells are eukaryotic? Eukaryotic means? Exactly. They are not simple cells. They are the regular cells with nucleus and all the organelles. And then starting with this kingdom, as I mentioned yesterday, uh, starting with this kingdom, we are going to be looking at things that are multicellular and complex. Now, we looked at some of the protists that were multicellular, but they were very simple. Like some of the multicellular algae, like the seaweeds, all of the cells, there's some differentiation, but they're very similar. So they don't have true stems and leaves and roots and flowers. But multicellular and complex, and as we look at fungi tomorrow, as we'll look at mushrooms and molds and a few things, you'll be able to see there's very different kinds of cells that make up the mushroom. And you might remember way back, we talked about the cells are organized into tissues and organs, and that's easiest to think about when you think about humans or living things. You have cells, tissues, organs, organ systems. So you have skin cells. Those skin cells all together make your skin system, which is your skin and your hair and your fingernails, organs, and then an organ system. So something like, blood vessels, heart, circulatory system. So we start with these kingdoms are much bigger, but they're much more complex. And because of that, they can live in different areas. Now you notice here it says except yeast. So yeast is actually considered to be a fungus. However, it is single-celled. Now, why is it put here instead of as a fungus like protist? Well, that's a little bit unclear, but I believe if you remember the fungus like protist, it says all of them are able to move at some point during their life cycle. So I'm guessing that's why. Um, but anyways, yeast is a bit of a strange exception. It is single-celled, and it is considered to be a fungus. So, eukarya, fungi, multicellular and complex. Then, and you saw this in the brain pop yesterday, and in fact, if you are interested in reviewing, watching the brain pop, watching Tim and Moby is a really good way to review what we're doing here. Anyways, as I was saying, on the brain pop yesterday, one of the really interesting things, so fungi get their own kingdom because they are in some ways like plants and in some ways like animals. They do actually have cell walls, but the cell walls are not made out of cellulose like plants are. They're made out of something called chitin, which is a protein. You don't really have to remember that, but the very interesting thing about that is this is the same protein that makes up insect exoskeletons. So it's kind of interesting. But the cell walls allow it to be multicellular and complex, allow it to be a little bit bigger, a little bit taller. They certainly are not as tall or big or strong as trees and other plants, but it does give them a cell wall. Exactly. They can be huge, but they're not tall. They can cover very large areas of the ground. But even the biggest mushrooms are maybe, I don't know, a foot tall, right? They don't grow tall like trees. The cell walls in trees allow them a different kind of structure. Okay, then how do they reproduce? Reproduce is something we need for all of our living things. This is one of the very unique things about how fungus reproduce. Um, they create something called spores. The spores are actually a little bit like seeds, except that they are nearly microscopic. Now, if you've ever touched a mushroom, and you know the gills on the bottom, so you've got the cap, and then you've got the gills. If you ever touch that with your finger and you get a little bit of brown powder on your fingers, those are the spores. Or in your yard, if you ever kick a mushroom or step on it and you see that little just like puff, almost of smoke, those are the spores. And so they're much like seeds, only they are very microscopic, very tiny, and they just kind of float through the air and land on things and then just hang out there until um, they are there's the right conditions to grow. And on the next slide, I'll go into a little bit more detail. They're a lot like seeds. It can be asexual, which makes a clone, or sexual. And I'll show you in a minute kind of how that happens. Question? Well, so if you eat the spores, probably not. Our digestive system, you know that in your stomach there's acid that breaks down proteins. So these are made of proteins. So for the most part, when you eat things, your body just digests it. Now, mushrooms can be very dangerous because some of them produce really nasty chemicals, poisonous chemicals, and that can make you very sick or kill you. The more dangerous thing about the spores is breathing them. Some people are very allergic to them, um, and so they can make you sick in that way, cause asthma attacks, allergies, that kind of stuff. And so that's why things like black mold, things like that, mold in your house, it doesn't smell good, and it can be it can be actually dangerous to your health because of that. So we'll get to that in a minute. And then, of course, they are heterotrophs. They are all decomposers. Um, and you could call them, some of them could be parasites. The Brain Pop video mentioned too that some of them live in symbiosis with the roots of plants. They help get nutrients for the roots, and the plants couldn't live without them. Brain Pop also mentioned that something like 30% of plant diseases are caused by fungi. You might remember when we did our fast plant lab, when we talked about reasons why seeds don't grow. What's one of the main reasons seeds don't grow? They get too wet and moldy. So mold causes problems with that. Okay? All right. So they're all heterotrophs. Um, decomposers. I said all decomposers. We should probably say they're all heterotrophs and most are decomposers. Because like yeast breaks down sugars, right? Um, yes, and yeast, we'll get to that. Yeast is very important in making bread. It's used to make beer because as it eats the sugar, it produces carbon dioxide. It does respiration or fermentation, and that carbon dioxide makes bubbles, which makes your bread rise. Okay? And then you cook whatever it is, and usually denatures the, yeah. Yes. All right, so next, let's go into a little bit more detail about how they are reproducing. So let's go ahead and we're just going to start over on this so that you can see step by step. So let's draw ourselves a nice simple mushroom, and we'll talk about all the different parts. There's a picture in the book, but you will need to know, um, I'm going to draw this green so you know it's the ground, and the mushroom will be black. So then you see the mushroom, and this is a full-grown mushroom. We're going to label all the parts. We're going to talk about how it works, talk about how it reproduces. Okay. So one thing that is true about all the fungi is they are made up of these, the cells are organized into these tiny thread-like structures called hyphae. So hyphae are thread-like like structures that make up fungi, molds, and mushrooms mostly. And if you've ever seen, you guys know what mold looks like, and it has that kind of fuzzy appearance. In in those in mold, the hyphae are all kind of just here. Let's draw. Should we draw a piece of bread, an orange, your lunch? Okay, here's this is bread, and here's an orange. Okay, and so when you get mold growing on that, what happens is the little mold, you've got the little hyphae, and they go all the way down through here, and then you see those little filamentous things here. Or same thing, on the orange, you'll see the green fuzzy stuff here, and what you don't see, there's a really nice kind of disgusting picture in the book. The hyphae, the little individual hyphae, are actually going through the entire orange, but it's just this part, and then this part right here that's getting kind of decomposed gets all squishy and soft. Okay? Yes? Yep. The question is? Okay. So ask me again in a minute. We're going to come back to the mold there in a minute. Let's label the mushroom. You have hyphae here, but they look a little bit different. So these hyphae act as roots. Hyphae. You know how if there's a mushroom growing in the ground, you can just kind of tap it with your foot and it falls out, right? So they do have root-like structures called hyphae, but they're not strong like plant roots, right? And then here, yes, these are hyphae that make up the stem. I don't remember if the textbook calls it this. The mycelium is just a whole bunch of hyphae together making the stem. And then this, which we would call the cap of the mushroom, is also known as the fruiting body. And the whole point of the fruiting body, just like fruit in plants, the whole point of the fruiting body is reproduction. It's producing spores. So produces spores. And particularly here on the gills. Now these are called gills because they look like the gills of fish, but they've got nothing to do with breathing. They're just called that because that's what they look like. So the gills produce the spores. And so many times it just reproduces asexually and makes a clone of itself. So the cells just go through mitosis, make little spores. Let's make the spores a different color here. And then they can land on something and then grow. On the yeast over here too, excuse me, not the yeast, the mold, the bread mold, on these hyphae, you'll get these little, it's kind of like a little ball at the top that's sometimes colored like green or red. And that, if you looked at it close up, looks like this. And that is also the fruiting body that produces spores in a mold. Now, sometimes they do reproduce sexually. And what happens there, this is kind of cool, is you'll get a second mushroom growing over here. Let's make a blue one so we can tell the difference. And here he's got his hyphae coming out like this. Mycelium, his fruiting body. And then what happens is these hyphae come over here and they meet up with these hyphae, and the cells fuse together, and so you get some genes from some chromosomes from each of the parents, and then you get a new mushroom that has characteristics of both. So that's considered sexual reproduction because you have two parents. And so there you've got sexual reproduction because you have both, because you have two parents. You've got new combinations. Make sense? All right. Next, I wanted to go over real quickly what those hyphae are doing. We said they're heterotrophs. We said they're decomposers. But how exactly is that happening? Well, that's just another reproduction picture there. You can see the cloning. You can see the sexual and the asexual reproduction. Let's do a new page, and let's talk about how they eat. Okay, so what happens is the hyphae that act like roots, let's call it root-like, because true plant roots are a little bit different. The hyphae produce basically a digestive juice. So it's digesting whatever it's growing on, and then it just kind of sucks it up. That's why when you've got it growing on your fruit or whatever, the fruit gets all mushy and nasty on that one side because it's actually being digested on the outside and then sucked into the mushroom. So produce digestive juice, then absorb nutrients. And this is true for both mushrooms and for molds. And for any of the fungus, whatever it's growing on, that's what it's digesting. It's digesting what it grows on. And so once again, we could have oranges or something that get moldy. You've got, it looks green because the fruiting bodies are green. And then the part you can't see going down into there are lots of hyphae. So they're very thread-like. They're practically invisible, the ones that are going down in here. And then here where it's green, the green mold is going to be the fruiting bodies. And as this part here gets all mushy, it's because it's all digested. So it squirts out the digestive juices, digests whatever it's growing on, and then sucks it up for nutrition. All good? All right. Then just kind of wrapping it up here in terms of things you need on your posters. Interactions with other living things. How are they helpful? How are they harmful? So again, Brain Pop went over some of this. You should have read about it in the book. There's lots of ways that fungus are helpful and harmful. First of all, whereas they are helpful, most of the antibiotics that we use are derived from molds. So penicillin is derived, penicillin, amoxicillin, most of those are, it's a chemical that's produced by the molds. The molds actually produce the antibiotic to kill bacteria, so the bacteria doesn't kill the molds. But we've said, hey, this is a really useful substance, so we grow it on purpose and then purify it, of course, and use it for antibiotics. Before the discovery and production of antibiotics, people died from many simple bacterial infections that are totally treatable now. Another way they are helpful, as we mentioned, they have a symbiotic relationship with the roots of many plants to help the plants grow, help get the nutrients out of the soil. Of course, they are a food source. We could just eat mushrooms, of course, and then the textbook has a whole list of things. Tim and Moby had a whole list of things. But bread, we of course use yeast to make bread and all the bread products you can think of, because as the yeast eats, as it eats the sugar, guys, through respiration, it uses the energy in the sugar and produces carbon dioxide, which carbon dioxide gas bubbles. That makes your bread rise, makes your pizza dough rise. And yes, it does also put the bubbles into beer. The other thing it does, though, remember when we talked about respiration, if you slow it down and don't give it enough oxygen, then it does something called fermentation, and it not only produces a little bit of carbon dioxide, but it produces alcohol as a waste product. And so um, yeast is very important in the making of lots of alcoholic beverages. It's also used, of course, in making cheeses, especially things like blue cheese, gorgonzola, um, and those cheeses, of course, have that kind of, and sometimes you can actually see it looks a little fuzzy in those blue stripes, and that's a mold. Um, when you eat blue cheese, you are eating a type of mold. Yes. And then ways they are harmful, again, pretty obvious. The flip side of all this, they can destroy crops and food. Brain Pop said that something like 30% of all crop damage is due to molds, funguses. And again, molds, you know what we didn't put on the general characteristics? Where do molds live? Mo yeah, so damp, warm, usually damp, warm environments. It doesn't have to be very hot, but they need to be away from direct sunlight, and they need a damp environment. Not as watery and wet as protists do, but it has to be more of a damp environment. So here in Colorado, we don't have as much of the, mushrooms growing in your lawn and mold in houses, except for maybe in your bathrooms, right? Because bathrooms tend to be not as well ventilated and more humid, so you get molds and stuff. But in other places, if you live someplace very humid, you get a lot more mold um, growing everywhere. Hang on one second, let me just finish this. So mold and mildew allergies, destroying crops, things like ringworm, athlete's foot are actual fungal infections. You can get yeast infections. So less common than bacterial infections, but they do that. And the last question we'll look at here in just a second, where are they on the energy pyramid food web? Other questions? Yes. Right. And so that's usually what will happen is when you see mushrooms in your yard, it's usually, a shady place in the yard that doesn't dry out in the sun, or after all the flooding that we had in the fall. The other thing too, though, we're pretty fortunate here because it's so dry, but that's one of the reasons why flooding, you can imagine these places that had 2 or 3 feet of water in your basement, and so people were taking all this time and ripping out all the sheetrock and all that. The reason why you have to tear out all the sheetrock, all the carpeting, the school in North Boulder, the elementary school, they had to throw away everything that was like paper or fabric or wood. All had to be thrown away. And the reason why is because the bacteria, so the water obviously wasn't clean water. It wasn't nasty. It wasn't sewer water, but it flowed through the streets and flowed. So big risk of bacterial infection. You don't know what's in it. But also, if that stays there, you get a lot of mold. So by tearing it all out down to, as far down to concrete and metal as you can, and then treating it makes it much safer. And especially something like a public school, obviously you can't have you can't have all sorts of nasty contaminants like that, and then put all the kids in there. But that's many of you spent a lot of time um, tearing out sheetrock and carpets and such, and that's the big reason why. And again, here not nearly as much of a problem, but places like you hear about Hurricane Katrina back in what 2004, 2005, huge deal because it's almost impossible to get that stuff to dry out. Many houses were condemned. Also, if you drive up through Lyons, Estes Park, places like that, you see many places that are not open, and there's signs on it from the health department. And it's either because there's structural damage or because there's water damage. All right, couple quick questions. Can mold get through laminated stuff? So generally, that's why we paint stuff or put plastic coating and stuff on. It should protect it, but if there's any little scratch or damage, you can usually see, right? Like in your bathroom or wherever, or on furniture that's been finished. Usually that protects it, but you can tell sometimes, and if the mold gets under that, then it grows under that, and so that uh, becomes a bit of a problem, right? Um, yes. Right. Yeah, once it starts to grow, it is so hard to get rid of. You can usually use bleach to kill it, but bleach can be pretty nasty as well. Um, the other thing you'll hear about, lichen. Lichen is that crusty stuff growing on rocks. It can be green or red or orange. It is really pretty, and this is something we do have a lot of here in Colorado. Um, And lichen is very interesting because it's actually a symbiotic relationship between algae and fungus, living somewhere that neither one of them could live by themselves. So the fungus anchors to the rock and actually uses the little hyphae and the little and its digestive juice to make a home there. And then it makes usually kind of a cup-shaped or home, and then green algae grows in it, and then the algae can make energy from the sunlight. So the fungus makes a home and maybe gets some minerals, and the algae gets energy from the sun, and it makes an awesome, sweet little thing called lichen. All right. And finally is, oh, we didn't do the energy pyramid. So where are the fungus going to go in a food web or an energy pyramid? Somebody said on the very bottom, but what goes on the very bottom? Yeah, so they're not producers, right? Yeah, so it's going to be all right. So in our food web or our energy pyramid, most of them are going to be decomposers. Let's do a different color here. And so decomposers are interesting because they're heterotrophs, right? They're not autotrophs. Put the producers down here. But the decomposers are interesting because they, of course, eat things at all different levels. So for the most part, they're not really going to fit neatly into here. So these are your consumers, your primary, secondary, and tertiary consumers, or heterotrophs. But these will break down anything that is dead, return the nutrients to the soil, and continue the cycle. All right, and as we wrap it up, I'll just put this picture here. These are pictures actually from the textbook, and you see a lot of interesting things here. This here, the roots of a pine seedling, and you see the roots, and then you see hyphae of fungi that are helping it out. So it helps spreads out that network. This is what yeast looks like. Again, very interesting. It's so totally different than the rest of the fungi. Bit of a exception. It reproduces by something called budding. So you get a cell, yeast cell, and then it just makes another one that grows out the side of it. Yes, like SpongeBob. Um, and then here we have yeast growing, excuse me, not yeast, we have mold, like penicillin mold. Here's the hyphae. This is one of those things, you might just cut off the moldy part, but the hyphae have probably grown through the rest of it. However, they're protein. I guess you can just digest them. Killer fungus attack this cricket. What happens is those tiny little dust-like spores might land on the back of the cricket where he can't scratch them off, and then the hyphae slowly grow into it. And obviously, this cricket is dead. And then the little fruiting bodies will explode and like this, and then kill other things. Oh, they can't, right? So they just get carried, the little spores, they just get carried by the wind and land wherever they can. So there's millions of them, and some of them might land someplace where it doesn't help. But it's actually really fascinating with the crickets. Also, one of the planet Earths, I have to find it from Misty West. In the rainforest, there's one particular fungus that it lands on ants, and before it actually gets to this stage, it makes them go a little bit crazy, and then they go back to the hive where all the other ants are, and then it infects all of them. So it's really insane. And then this is kind of a puffball mushroom, and you see this here. And picture from the book, lots of different mushrooms. You need pictures on your poster, and that is the end of that. And we'll take in